October 20th, 2021, two young couples were hanging out inside of a little home in the woods, Henderson County, North Carolina. The couples were Rachel and her fiance Chris, and their friends, Autumn and Jake, whose home it was. Rachel and Autumn were in the kitchen, preparing to dye Rachel's hair over the sink. Jake and Chris were in the living room, discussing the very strange sightings of a black panther that had been reported all over town in recent days. North Carolina does have big cats, including panthers. However, the panthers in North Carolina are typically of the brownish color, not the pitch black variety. Chris was absolutely convinced that he had seen this black panther about a week ago when he was out walking his and Rachel's new puppy. He'd begun to carry a gun for protection. Jake was in the middle of telling Chris that he too was now carrying a gun around for the same reason when they were interrupted by Rachel calling for Chris from the kitchen, where Rachel told them that she'd been trying to show Autumn a YouTube video about how to dye hair at home when her phone had died. So she asked Chris if he wouldn't mind going back to their apartment and getting her a phone charger. And as Chris headed to the door to leave, Jake said, "Hold on a minute," grabbed his flashlight and grabbed his gun and told Chris he would tag along and watch his buddies back. They both stayed absolutely quiet as they walked because they wanted to make sure they could hear any indication of this panther being nearby. Halfway down the path, Chris suddenly heard something coming from the woods. They both froze, and then Jake raised his flashlight and shined it at the underbrush where Chris was saying he had heard noise. All they saw were green leaves, and two eyes opened up and reflected back at them. And it was just a raccoon. Chris and Jake laughed in relief and then continued walking down the path to Chris's house. They went inside, got Rachel's charger, and then they left and stepped back into the woods. Something just felt different. It was now strangely quiet. They were about 40 feet away from Jake's house when they suddenly heard a twig snap to their left. They heard another sound, a low, raspy growl. Jake aimed his flashlight at the bush where these noises had come from, and this time it was obvious it was not a raccoon because the bushes were literally shaking like some enormous animal was inside of them. And so the two men drew their guns and they aimed it at the bush, hoping that this thing would just take off back into the woods, but it didn't. And so the men just opened fire, and they kept on shooting until they heard a new horrible sound. And the second they heard it, they dropped their guns. It would turn out, after Chris and Jake had left the house, Rachel and Autumn decided to pull a prank. They had found some expired eggs in the fridge, and they had decided they would go hide in the bushes near that pathway and pelt the guys with them. When Rachel saw Chris and Jake approaching, she tried to crouch down lower in the bush so as not to be seen, but as she did, she stepped on a twig. And at the same time, in anticipation of their prank, the women started to laugh. They tried to stifle their laughter, but that only made them snort and shake the bushes. So they drew their guns and they began to until they heard Autumn scream out in horror. Tragically, by the time they had stopped shooting, it was already too late for Rachel. She had been shot to death. Law enforcement did an investigation into the shooting, and they declared it was just a horrible accident. Everybody was sober, and the two men were carrying their weapons legally. No one was ever charged with Rachel's death.